On July 26, 1974, a female jogger was out for her daily exercise on a Cape Cod beach. She noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. It was a human skull sitting in the sand about 2 feet from the surface. The woman called the police, and when they arrived, they confirmed it was indeed a skull. They also found some other bones nearby, and at first they thought they'd stumbled upon the remnants of an old Native American burial ground. But the bones were too new, and this part of Cape Cod has never been home to any native tribes. So what was going on here? Over the next few days, more body parts turned up, including a full skeleton. Who was this person, and how did they die? In this episode of Buried in the Dunes, we'll uncover the secrets behind one of America's most baffling unsolved mysteries. It was around 10 a.m. on Tuesday, July, when the jogger spotted the skull. She didn't want to believe what she was seeing, so she continued on her run, hoping the horrible image would fade from view. But by the time she finished her jog and went back to grab the skull, it was still there. Knowing she had to do something, she called the police. When they arrived, the officers were surprised to find the skull sitting right in the open. There were no obvious signs of foul play and nothing else out of the ordinary. At first, they considered asking the local hospitals if anyone was missing a body part. But since it was summer, and people frequently got injured while swimming or boating, they figured this must have been another case of someone getting hurt and then washed up on shore. But the following morning, another jogger found a femur about 30 feet away from where the skull had been discovered. This was far from where someone could have possibly lost their bone while swimming. Something was definitely strange going on here. The area where the bones were found is called Nauset Beach, located at the southern end of the Cape Cod National Seashore in Massachusetts. Back in 1974, this was a secluded spot with no houses or businesses nearby. There was a small cottage about half a mile north, but that was it. The nearest neighbors were over a mile away. So why would someone come all the way out here to commit a crime? And what was the connection between the skull and the femur? The police were desperate for answers, but all they had to go on were 2 bones and a hunch. Before long, though, more body parts started turning up, helping the police piece together who this mystery victim was. A few days after the initial discovery, a woman walking her dog found a thigh bone near the waterline. A few days after that, someone looking out their window saw a shoe on the beach. And on August, a boy found a watch and some jewelry. All these discoveries led the police to conclude that the bones belonged to a single person, but they had no idea who. The only clue was the shoe, which was a woman's size 8 brown leather sandal with the brand name Capezio embossed on the side. The police put out an alert asking if anyone had recently lost a loved one wearing those exact shoes, but nobody came forward. Weeks turned into months, and the case grew colder and colder. Still, the police hadn't given up hope. They just needed another lead. In early November, 4 months after the original discovery, 2 men working on a dune project near where the body parts had been found uncovered a clump of bones. When they brushed the sand away, they realized they had found a complete skeleton, including the skull. It was missing its jaw, though. At this point, the police knew they had a murder on their hands. Someone had taken the time to dismember this woman and bury her remains on the beach. But who was she, and why was she killed? The woman was eventually identified through fingerprints, but it wasn't easy. She was neither registered as a voter nor listed in any phone directories. And since she was unidentified for so long, she became known only as the Lady of the Dunes. But once the police checked the National Fingerprint Database, they got a hit. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry, and she was a 47-year-old dental assistant from New York City. But this didn't really answer any questions. The police still didn't know why she was on the beach, or who was responsible for her death. And the more they investigated, the more bizarre details surrounding the case emerged. For example, Ruth's teeth were filled with gold, suggesting she was well off financially. Yet she was driving a car that was almost 20 years old and had been reported stolen from Long Island in 1953. Additionally, she had several aliases and was wanted for questioning in connection with a stolen car from June. Furthermore, according to friends and family, Ruth was not the type to take a vacation alone, and there was no evidence she ever visited Cape Cod. Why would she travel all the way out here and then get murdered? But perhaps the weirdest thing about the case was the autopsy results. After having been buried in the sand for so long, most of Ruth's organs had completely decomposed. The only ones still intact were her brain and eyes. Pathologists later concluded that she had been strangled, but her skeleton showed no signs of trauma, meaning she was likely already dead when her body was dismembered. So how did the killer dismember her without cutting into any of the bones? This was a real head-scratcher. The years passed, the case grew colder and colder, and leads began to dry up. Theories abounded, but none could explain every aspect of the case. Some believed Ruth had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd in New York City and had been killed as a result. Others suspected her ex-husband, a dentist named Erwin Terry, had something to do with her disappearance, although he had an alibi for the time of the murder. Erwin and Ruth had divorced in 1972 after 25 years of marriage, and he was remarried at the time of her death. Some wondered if perhaps he had killed Ruth out of jealousy after discovering she was seeing someone else. But this seemed unlikely, as Ruth had no obvious lover, and her body showed no signs of sexual assault. Another theory posited that Ruth had planned to run away from her life in New York City and had chosen Cape Cod because she had family living nearby. However, the police never verified this theory, and it remained just that, a theory. The truth was, the police never even had a good idea of what had happened to Ruth, let alone who was responsible. All they knew was that someone had gone to great lengths to cover up their crime. In 1980, the case was featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted, but this failed to turn up any new leads. It seemed the Lady of the Dunes would never get her justice. But in 2021, the case went viral, and people began pressuring the police to reopen the investigation using new technology. To this day, though, the case remains officially closed, with no suspect having ever been identified. If you ask me, there are a few things that don't add up. First of all, why did the killer dismember the woman but not damage the bones? And second, why choose such a remote location to dispose of her body? Surely the killer knew the police would eventually find her remains. So why not dump her body somewhere less conspicuous? Perhaps the killer was trying to send a message by leaving her remains in plain sight, but if that was the case, why leave behind her shoe and other belongings? Maybe the killer just panicked and didn't know what to do. But if that was true, why wait for months to bury the rest of her remains? There are just too many unanswered questions in this case, and no one will ever know for sure what happened to Ruth. If you have any theories of your own, feel free to share them below, and make sure to like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.